I'm a madman. I'm a lunatic, bad man, poison the water in your community. My name is Kefka, and I'll wreck ya. Pause for the break, after which I'll disrespect ya.
What's up, my wizards? It's Dev. From Mtg, we like magic, and today we're going to cover a deck that's been getting a lot of buzz lately online. Here's Black-Green Mastermind. This deck's been getting a lot of notoriety lately. If you haven't heard of it, it all started when a guy named Musasabe, I hope I'm getting that right, the original architect of this deck, went 5-0 in League on MTGO, and then, of course, those results got published in the MTGO League results, and then Eric Froelich noticed the deck and published it as his deck of the day on Channel Fireball, and ever since then, usage of the deck has really exploded on MTGO, as has the Reddit thread for the deck. There are well over a couple hundred replies on that thread, all discussing where to go from here with this deck and the proper build for it. So there's a lot of people talking about this deck right now, and a lot of people who are really into it. It's a pretty neat looking deck, especially if you like the Seasons Past deck from a couple of seasons ago. It's got a lot of things in common with that deck. It's essentially a green-black control deck that has a lot of removal, rides out the game, grinds out the game, goes really, really long, and then gets insane card advantage really, really late to close the game out. But I sort of also have my own selfish personal reasons for liking this deck, not the least of which is the fact that it's at least partially built around the card that just happens to be my exclusive spoiler for Rivals, Mastermind's Acquisition. The deck only plays a 2 of this card, but don't let that fool you. A lot of what the deck is doing is based around this. Now, it might just look like a juiced-up Diabolic Tutor, but when you build the deck around it, it allows you to do some really cool stuff, you know? We get to play, a toolbox strategy. 1 and 2 ofs a bunch of cards, because we have access to not only every card in our main deck with this, but also all of the cards in our sideboard, so it'll affect the way we build our sideboard, too. Now, I'm not going to spend too long talking about Mastermind right this second, because I'll reference the card 100 times in this video. Don't worry, we'll get back to it. But just for purposes of clarity, I do want to point out before we move on that a card you own from outside the game just means a card from your sideboard. In this instance, you can no longer use this to pluck cards that have gone into exile, out of exile. Can't do that anymore, but that doesn't stop the deck from doing some really disgusting, hilarious stuff. But another kind of personal reason that I like this deck is because it's also built, partially at least, around another card that I have made no bones about being one of my pet cards in Rivals of Ixalan. It plays 3 copies of Azor's Gateway. I just finished hyping how good this card was in the black-red control deck, and it shows up here as well. And it has a similar function, although the 2 decks are pretty far apart in what they're trying to do. The black-red control deck had a lot more creatures than this deck. This deck literally plays 1 creature. It's a little bit more all-in on Azor's Gateway than the black-red control deck was. But once you do flip Gateway in this deck, that's when the really righteous stuff starts happening. The deck doesn't have to flip Gateway to win the game or anything, but it really goes a long way. A lot of the stuff that you want to win the game with in this deck really requires a lot of mana, so you can just do it faster and more efficiently and have a lot more fun with it if you do flip a Gateway over into a Sanctum of the Sun. But on its way to flipping over, that's when the card is at its best. I keep telling you, man, this is just a 2-mana artifact that doesn't stretch the mana base. It's only 1 mana to sort of loot. Yeah, the other card goes into exile, but it's still a really good card selection piece that a lot of decks would kill for, back in the day at least, To have an artifact like this that filters a card literally every turn is really, really powerful mojo, man. So even before the card flips over into the ridiculous land that is no doubt crazy, I'm not taking anything away from Sanctum of the Sun, but Gateway itself is a really powerful card in terms of seeing more cards in your opponent and getting access to the pieces you need at any given time. Azor's Gateway is really good for that. Couple of other tech points, though, before I move on from this card. First of all, you can pitch Gateways to Gateway. If you've already got a Gateway out, obviously you don't want other copies rotting in your hand. Luckily, they don't have to. This can be the 2-mana thing that you exile with it, So there's that, but also you can exile an extra Mastermind's Acquisition if you happen to draw your second one. You really only need 1 in a game, and there are times when you'll be bringing that one back from your graveyard, definitely, but you don't usually need both copies of Acquisition. So if you run into your second one, you can exile it away too. It's a pretty safe 4-mana card to exile towards flipping the gate. Oh, and actually, one more thing. Once you do flip Gateway over, you can usually tap Sanctum of the Sun, cast Mastermind's Acquisition, and have the mana left over to cast whatever you tutored for. So there's just some really cool interaction between these 2 cards. Actually, one more cool thing about the two cards together. If you play Gateway with Acquisition, it allows you to like spend more main deck slots on removal and stuff that helps you get later on in the game to where you can actually flip your Gateway over. And then you cast Mastermind's Acquisition and all those crazy, huge mana win conditions that would otherwise be like gumming up your hand in the early and mid game. You don't want those cards in your hand until you can cast them. Well, with Acquisition, it allows you to do just that. Once you flip over Gateway, you've got all the mana in the world. You can just cast Acquisition and just go leisurely fetch whatever card from your sideboard that you need, whatever 8 mana crazy, win the game option that you have in mind. So I really like that about it too. It allows you to play all these good win conditions for a Sanctum of the Sun while not necessarily like sacrificing deck slots for them in the main. All that said, though, this is a kind of slow strategy. Just on its surface, it's kind of easy to tell. It takes a bunch of turns to flip over a Gateway, and it takes, you're basically taking your turn 4 off if you play Acquisition on curve. Usually you'll play it later in the game, but there are definitely tricks to where you play it on curve and you have a crazy turn 5 play in your hand. That's often very relevant, but for the most part, you're still taking off a turn, and you don't want to do that. That slows you down an awful lot. So we've got to cover the board to make sure we can get to the point in the game where these plays are even relevant. So we're playing a buttload of removal in this deck, and I'll go through most of it with using slides because technology is good, but I do want to spotlight one piece of removal that we're playing, the 2 copies of Battle at the Bridge. This card is super hot in this deck, even before you flip Gateway over, It's just a solid piece of removal, gains you some life back, helps stabilize that life total. We've got a few pieces of removal that do that in this deck. It's really important to preserve our life total so that once we do flip over Gateway, we have a high enough life total to get all the mana out of it. And yeah, Gateway gains us 5 life when it flips, important to remember, but we still need to make sure our life total doesn't get too out of hand, and this really helps, alongside some other pieces we're playing. So there's that. And it kills indestructible creatures, which is incredibly relevant in a format where Hazoret is a creature you really got to worry about. So there's that too. But once you do flip over into Sanctum of the Sun, this thing is absolutely nuts, It kills just about anything on the other side of the board that you want to kill, while gaining you a buttload of life. I don't care how many times I say buttload in this video. It gains you a buttload of life, sometimes as much as like 10, 12, 15 life, depending on what you're sitting on, once you flip your Sanctum over. And the cool thing about that is not only does it put you in a good position, for the next couple of turns, even if you're facing down a pretty decent board on the other side of the table, but it also makes it to where in subsequent turns when you tap your Sanctum, you'll be getting that much more mana out of it, If you gain like 10 life off of Battle at the Bridge, the next time you tap your Sanctum, you're getting some real mana. But we are playing a lot of other cards in our removal suite. Again, this is a really slow deck. We've got to keep the board clean as much as we can. So almost a third of our slots in this deck are dedicated to removal. But let me go through them real quick, as quickly as I can, because a lot of them are exactly the cards you think that we'd be playing. We're going to play 4 copies of Fatal Push, 3 copies of Moment of Craving, and 3 copies of Vraska's Contempt to start things off. A Fatal Push is just one of the best removal spells in possibly any format, you might say right now. So we're going to play all 4 copies of that. We're a slow deck. We got to keep creatures off our back in the early game. Doesn't get better than Fatal Push when it comes to that in this format. Vraska's Contempt is just very good right now. Maybe the best card in the whole format at taking out some of the biggest threats in the meta. When it comes to Scarab God, Hazoret, Ronus, there's a million, Rekindling Phoenix, just all the most annoying cards in the format. This card is a great answer to, and it also helps preserve your life total, just like Battle at the Bridge and Moment of Craving, which is seeing a lot of play here lately. Now, I've had a lot to say about Moment of Craving already in the past in just the last couple of videos. I gave Moment a special little spotlight of its own in the Top 8 Decks and Standard video. I have a lot of faith in this card, and it's seeing a lot more play recently, but there are some things I haven't said about it. Obviously, there's the basic stuff. Kills small creatures in the early game, especially mono red aggro creatures you'll have to worry about, and helps preserve your life total so it doesn't get too out of control against heavy aggro decks. All that is still true, but there are some things I haven't said about it. One of the tech things about this card is that it kills Adanto Vanguard, and there's a number of decks that you'll be running into Adanto Vanguard. The blue-white Auras deck, there's the green-white aggro deck, and of course, the black-white Vampires deck. Or even the mono-white, Aketra's Monument deck. You'll be running up against Adanto Vanguard in a number of lists in this format, so it is pretty important that this kills Vanguard. And 2 copies of it kills a Hazoret. That can also be really important, and I haven't mentioned that as of yet. We're also playing literally just a couple of sweepers in this deck. We've got a Bantu's Last Reckoning and a Yahini's Expertise. Whichever one we need to search up on turn 4 with an acquisition, we can then just play on turn 5. That can sometimes be really, really important. But this basically gives us the ability to play a sweeper on turn 3 or 4 or 5, depending on what we start the game with or what we draw into. It's cool that you can play Bantu's Last Reckoning on turn 5 after an acquisition and then still have a couple of mana left to play over with. I like that. And then the cool thing about Yahini's Expertise, there's a couple of cool things about this actually. If you go Yahini's Expertise into Moment of Craving for free, that can kill a Hazoret too, and you can set that up with a Mastermind's acquisition pretty easily no matter which card that you need. And also with Yahini's Expertise, this is a quote-unquote safe way to play an Azor's Gateway. You go turn 4 Yahini's Expertise or perhaps turn 5 after an acquisition. And then you can safely, for 0 mana, get an Azor's Gateway down onto the battlefield and not waste your second turn when you should be playing removal against certain decks. The deck also plays 4 whole copies of Doomfall. I talked about this in the Black-Red deck too. I was very, very confident that 4 Doomfall was the right choice, and apparently this Architect is as well. Doomfall is very, very good in this format right now, where you basically have to worry about 2 different extremes. You have to worry about mono-red aggro decks that are really fast. Then you have to worry about Grixis energy and control decks that are mid-range and, obviously very slow control decks that only play a few creatures. So you have to worry about the full spread, and Doomfall is good against pretty much all of it. You can get a creature off the board if you needed to, exiles it, as a matter of fact. There's plenty of ways that we can kill everything on the board except for Hazoret. There's plenty of ways we can kill everything except for Scarab God for good. And this helps exile, the last creature on the board, and often that will be Hazoret or the Scarab God, so it's good for that. But just in case we're not playing against aggro or a deck that has the Scarab God down already, we can also pluck those cards out of the opponent's hand, or we can get, counter spells out of the opponent's hand. We can sometimes get removal when it's pertinent out of the opponent's hand, but mostly this can clear the way for big spells that we need to resolve. So in that way, it's pretty much good against nearly every deck in the field. So it's worth a 4 of in just about any deck that's looking to slow roll, Especially decks that don't have access to counter spells. This is a way to proactively counter a spell when you think about it. So Doomfall is good for that, and it's flexible outside of that function too. So I like Doomfall a lot, but that's not all of the control hosing that we're going to be doing in this deck. It's not strictly control hosing, but Duress is, and we'll play a 3 of Duress in the main deck here, mostly because of how good it is against control and how bad we'd be against control otherwise. Just the playset of Doomfall and a 3 of main deck Duress just makes it to where we stretch pretty well no matter what we're playing against. We've got all this removal, and Doomfall doubles as that against the aggro and mid-range decks in the format. But again, 7 main deck pieces like this against control decks is going to give them huge headaches. It's very, very hard for counterspell decks, essentially, to beat us when we have all this main deck hate against them. But there's actually one more removal piece I want to cover. We're amazingly not done. This deck also plays 1 copy of Never Return in the main deck. You don't see this card very often, but I've never stopped liking it. This seems like a fine card to me. If this card came out 10 years ago, it would be, I would imagine, very heavily played back then. I think at least. Just the fact that this kills either, it's unconditional removal against any creature that essentially doesn't have Indestructible. That's relevant. But it also is another main deck answer outside of Contempt for a Chandra. And you'll run up against Chandra in, Grixis matchups, mono-red matchups, lots and lots of decks. I wouldn't be surprised if it was seriously like 45% of the field play Chandra right now. So this is another main deck answer to Chandra. And it's even good for getting, bad cards out of the graveyard on the other side of the board. It's a creature on our side. There's just a lot of cool things this does. And to stretch the tech even further, this counts as a 7 converted mana cost card if you want to exile it with Azor's Gateway. So there's a lot of cool little techie reasons to play the card, but you don't even need tech. It just unconditionally removes a thing, and that's cool. But we got to talk about maybe the weirdest looking card in the entire main deck, and that's the 4 copies of Hour of Promise that we're amazingly running. Again, it's not my deck. It looks a little bit weird when you first look at it, but then you get to thinking about it. This card is actually really, really neat in this deck. It gives us a virtual win condition, We've got 12 deserts in the deck, so it's very, very easy to get those couple of zombies, and that's 4 power on the battlefield. It's actually really, really relevant in a lot of matchups, especially against other, control decks. Just getting, 2 creatures on the board and 4 total power is actually really, really good against them. And the ability to go get whatever land we want super relevant too because we're playing a bunch of 1 and 2 of lands that'll be really important. We're playing like Scavenger Grounds against all the decks that manipulate the graveyard. We're playing Field of Ruin, and that's really important too. That's really important. We can go get a Field of Ruin with an Hour of Promise, and then when we're ready to flip our gateway over, we can use our Field of Ruin to kill their Field of Ruin before we flip into Sanctum. It protects our Sanctum. So there's lots of reasons why you'd need a specific land or two to be out in this deck, and this helps go fetch them up when you need it. The deck also, slightly weirdly, plays a one-of Gonti, Lord of Luxury in the main deck. This is actually really no joke, though, against the Grixis matchup. This can, whether you're playing against Energy or Control, this is a fantastic card that is sort of a win condition. Yeah, a 2/3 body's not going to do much for you on its own, but sometimes this can snag a really big creature to help you close out the game, And to finish off the main deck, kind of, we're actually going to cover the sideboard before we cover the lands in this deck, because the sideboard's just an extension of the deck in this list. But to finish off the sort of main deck, we're going to play 2 copies of Vraska here, which is one of our primary win conditions. Vraska's in the main deck because she can be, Some of our other win conditions are a little bit awkward. We'd rather not draw into them, but we don't really care if we draw a Vraska because she's always going to be good, so long as we can get to the mana to play her. So Vraska's just really fantastic right now. She's a win condition for a couple of reasons. She can make tokens for us. That's awesome. So long as we can keep the board clear on the other side, our tokens can just stomp in. And eventually, if we just keep plussing her, then she can ultimate. And with the tokens from herself and Hour of Promise, as long as you can just get 1 token in, which shouldn't be too hard with all the removal we've got in the deck. You can clean the other side of the board pretty clean. You get 1 token in after you've ultimated, you win the game that way. But here's that sideboard real quick, and I'll go over some of the win conditions out of the sideboard that we're playing before I go over the basic sideboard strategies here. First of all, there's Sandworm Convergence out of the board. This is another reason I like the deck, is because Sandworm Convergence is another card that was one of my exclusive previews. So there's just a lot of cards in this deck that I got to preview, and I think that's really cool. Sandworm Convergence is basically a win condition for us, though. Once we get it out of the board and play it, then we essentially win the game in just a couple of turns. It'll usually help you turn the corner. Just an awesome win condition for us. There's also the Torment of Hailfire, another win con out of the sideboard. Again, we don't want to draw a card like this out of the main deck, but once we need it, we're more than happy to tutor it out of the board and just win the game off of it. Once it resolves, you can't interact with it in any way. It just wins the game, given that you can pump enough mana into it, and you should be able to if things have gone your way. Also note the Arborback Stomper. There's sometimes where you'll play Acquisition on turn 4 just to go get your Stomper and be guaranteed to play it on turn 5. This can really help you turn the corner, gain you a bunch of life back against aggro decks. If you've already got the tools in your hand to beat their Hazoret, like a Vraska's Contempt or something, this can just be a great card. You play your Contempt, stabilize your life total, and then the next turn you can get your Arborback Stomper down, and it just blocks and lives against almost anything on their side of the board, and it just gained you a huge chunk back. It's a threat unto itself. Stomper can sometimes even be brought in against control decks if you just need a threat that can close out the game quickly. Stomper's awesome. But maybe the most notable card in the whole sideboard is Wildest Dreams, which really makes a lot of what this deck is trying to do happen. Now, a lot of the time, when you flip over Gateway into Sanctum of the Sun, you can tap it, use Mastermind's Acquisition to get the Wildest Dreams out of your board, and still have mana left over to cast a huge Wildest Dreams. If things go your way, you can return most of your graveyard to your hand with Wildest Dreams, and that's when things go crazy. This is the card that makes the deck pretty reminiscent of the Seasons Past deck, because you get, a lot of the cards from your graveyard back into your hand. It's just unbelievable card advantage. Getting a refill like that in the late game is just crazy, and it'll usually lead to you winning the game. You get all your tutors back, you get your masterminds back out of the graveyard. You get all that removal out of the graveyard if you need it. You get these Battle at the Bridge back, and that leads to more life gain. At this point you can tap your Sanctums for lots and lots of mana. So you can use that to cast your Battle at the Bridge again and just gain another 20, 25, 30 life sometimes. Just things get completely out of hand when you can get these cards back out of your graveyard. You can cast your Hour of Promises again. Sometimes you can cast 2 Hour of Promise again. just by tapping, Sanctum once. It's just crazy. That's a bunch of tokens, lots of power on the board, demands a sweeper against control decks, can win the game that way. So there's just like crazy stuff you can do once you resolve a Wildest Dreams after you've flipped. And we're trying to put ourselves in a position where you can do it. It seems like Christmas Land, but the deck is built to do literally exactly that. Goes long, flips Gateway into Sanctum, and plays Wildest Dreams out of the sideboard to get ridiculous card advantage and essentially start the game over. You've got all this removal in your hand, you've got all your crazy bomb win conditions back in your hand, and your opponent essentially has nothing because you've been keeping them at nothing the whole game. But, believe it or not, we're also playing just normal sideboard cards. We got to do that too. We've got the 4th copy of Duress in there against control decks, as well as an Argyll's Bloodfast. This is good against control as well. We don't really care that much, as much at least, about our life total in that match. Plus, we've got some other tools in the deck to help control the life total. So, it never feels too bad against control to draw cards with Bloodfast. We've also got Lost Legacy. This is good against control as well, but especially good against those approach builds that you'll run across every now and again. But we got to have some tools against aggro too. That's not the best matchup in the world for us. So we've got some Gifted Aetherborn in there, 3 whole copies to bring in game 2 and 3 against aggro decks. And we've also got another Yahini's Expertise to help sweep the board. Against combo decks and decks that rely on artifacts, we're going to have Naturalize. This is decent against a lot of the field, actually. God Pharaoh's Gift, Heart of Kiran. This is good against Anointed Procession and Hidden Stockpile decks and stuff. You'd be surprised the amount of stuff Naturalize can do, and it's pretty handy to be able to go search it up sometimes with Masterminds and play it game 1. And here are your lands. We're playing 26 of them in the deck. That's a lot, but we're a control deck, and again, we're super hungry for mana. And we get to play extra lands because that gives us more lands to exile away to Azor's Gateway. It counts as a 0-cost card. So that's important too sometimes. We need a couple extra lands so we can safely do that. So we need every last bit of these, and some of them are extra relevant. I've already talked about Scavenger Grounds. Field of Ruin is especially good in this deck and will help us, protect our Sanctum of the Sun from getting Field of Ruined. That's actually a really important play. I want to hammer that in. But you also see all the deserts here. That's so we can get Hour of Promise to proc reliably, So there's lots of reasons we want to play all the deserts too. And sometimes even just the common deserts can be great cycling tools when we no longer need lands. And here are your power rankings, or at least what I think they'd be for this deck. I don't have a whole lot of experience with this one, but I did just come off of playing the Black-Red deck with Azor's Gateway, which is a little bit like this one, but not built around acquisition. Again, the two decks are very different, but this is about where I'd put the power level here. We're extremely versatile. We've got all the defense in the world, but we're not a very fast deck. We've got next to no offense, but we do have a stacked sideboard. So this is about what things would look like to me. Above average synergy, but we don't depend on our synergy, so it's not, an 8 or a 9, but we are building the deck from the top down around a couple of cards. So there is some synergy present here. So this is about what I think it would look like. It's a 66 on the board, but again, take it with a grain of salt. I don't have a whole lot of experience with this one. So in lieu of talking a whole lot about the power rankings and all that, and I've already talked a lot about how the deck plays as we've gone through the video, I think we need to talk just for a second about maybe where to take the deck from here, because I doubt that this is the finished form, the final form of the deck. First of all, I was pleasantly surprised. I was happy to see this deck because I'd been working on a black-white deck that was a lot like this. It played Mastermind's Acquisition at a 2 of, it played Azor's Gateway, and it mostly wanted to, Acquisition on turn 4 for good turn 5 plays. There's a lot of good white 5-drops, like Fumigate and Regal Caracal, Angel of Sanctums, Angel of Invention. There's a ton of good white 5-drops we can play at a 1 or 2 of. And I was trying that out. I think that might be a direction to take the deck, but this deck looks a lot more fun. We get Wildest Dreams, and that play is just absolutely crazy to bring back half or more of your graveyard all at one time. The card advantage is just crazy. So I really like having access to that play. So I don't want a whole bunch of, white 5-drops that take double white, because I just don't know that the deck would be able to do that. But if we were going to add a color, I'd at least maybe look at adding blue. The deck looks like it might have some interest in playing counterspells, namely Negate. I don't know about any double blue counterspells like Disallow, but at least Negate, and possibly even a couple of Essence Scatter. Maybe Censor, Supreme Will, all these are possible. But I'd really like to see a 1 or 2 of Negate, even in the board of this deck. And I think that the deck wants it too. And if you had access to blue, you'd also maybe be able to play Pull from Tomorrow. I know that that's double blue, so it's a little bit, but Pull from Tomorrow looks especially strong to be able to cast with a flip Sanctum. And you could even play like a one of Nizahal in the sideboard. That seems like it'd be nice to have access to against other control decks. So I like a lot about the idea of adding blue, but I'm not really sure about it. It seems like the deck wants to be consistent. It's essentially a mono black deck with some green cards in the sideboard and Vraska's in the main, or Vraska herself in the main. So there's really not a whole lot of green to the deck already. It's mostly mono black, so I don't know if it could support a third color. But, it's got a lot of mana fixing, Hour of Promise, Field of Ruin. It could add Evolving Wilds. That would help it Revolt Fatal Push easier. So maybe we could fit a third color. I don't know. How do you guys feel? Let me know down there in the sideboard. Continue the discussion. Would we just keep the deck as it is, or are there some improvements we can make, and what are they? And if you're interested in checking out this deck list as is, just as usual, hit the first link down there in the description. That'll take you over to TCG Player. They help sponsor my content, but the good folks too. They're where you can get this deck for the absolute cheapest online right now. Actually, the price of this deck is not as out of control as you might think. It's about $165 to build this deck as is right now, and you could do a whole lot worse than that in this standard. It's by no means budget, but $165 isn't too bad either. It's not like we're paying $250 to build this thing. But I'm pretty sure that leaves me tapped out for this one. That's all I've got to say about this deck for now, but I'm super excited about it. Both for cool reasons. I like the Seasons Pass deck from a couple of seasons ago. I like control decks that don't play blue. It's always a favorite of mine. I like Azor's Gateway, and this thing has two different, preview cards of mine in it. So there's lots of reasons for me to like it, but I know that a lot of people are interested in this deck right now. So let me know how you felt about it down there in the comment section. Like the video if you liked the video. Puts it in more recommended feeds. And even if you didn't like it, I hope that you hit thumbs up. Lie to me. I don't care. You can follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev, or you can throw me $1 a month on patreon.com/SBMTG. I'll leave you a link down there in the description if you feel like doing that too. But I'll catch you cats later. And actually, I have had two cats this whole time. I don't know if you can see them. I don't think they've been on camera with me. They've just been kind of comatose in my lap. Bye, Julie. I've made the mistake of picking you up. I'm so sorry, princess. But in any case, I have had cats this whole time. I'm sorry to deprive you of cats. Just the camera angle is wrong. So anyway, I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. No matter what you do, remember to spread love and be kind.